Hey guys, it's Rachel from Hope Corner Farm. Today we're going to learn how to make a fleece tie blanket. It's a quick and easy project that I think you're going to love. We're going to have to gather some materials, and before we get started, make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to get notifications for when I post new videos.
You're going to need to gather some supplies to make this tie fleece blanket. First off, the most important thing is you're going to need 2 separate cuts of polar fleece that is 60 inches wide, cut at 2 yards in length. So you're going to have a total of 4 yards of fabric, 2 yards for the front and 2 yards for the back. So you can see I have this bobcat fleece for the front and this gold fleece for the back. Each of them is cut at 2 yards in length. You're going to need a rotary cutting mat. You're going to need a rotary cutter and/or scissors and rulers to help you measure your ties. You're also going to need some pins to pin your fabric together so it doesn't move around as you're getting ready to tie. Once you've gathered all your materials, we'll get started. So step 1 is to take one of your pieces of fleece and lay it flat out on the floor so you have room for cutting it up and making it even with the other piece of fabric. So go ahead and get out one of your pieces of fleece and lay it flat on the floor. One thing to keep in mind is if you have a good side and a bad side, or a right side or a wrong side to your fabric, you need to have the nice side, the good side, the right side face down on the floor. So what's facing up towards us right now is the wrong side or the bad side of the fabric. So keep that in mind. Okay, so step 2 is taking the second piece of fleece that you have and placing it directly on top of the other piece of fleece. Now here in this case, you want the good side, the right side facing up. So you can see in my example here, I've got my fabric facing the correct way. It's facing up because it's what's going to be seen on the outside. So basically you want the wrong sides or the bad sides kind of pinned together on the inside of this blanket. One thing you may notice about my blanket right now is that the 2 pieces of fabric are not the same. That happens sometimes when you're buying fabric from 2 separate sources, and that's okay. We're just going to end up trimming up this blanket to match the smallest piece of fabric. The other trimming that we're going to do is we're going to take off the selvage edge of this fabric and make it nice and neat. You can see especially on the bobcat fabric this big white selvage that it has on the edge of it, and we're going to cut that off. So that's the next step. So let's get our scissors or our rotary cutter, whichever you would prefer to use, and we're going to trim up our blanket so that all sides are equal. After we line up our fabric and get it nice and even, or at least as nice and even as we can until we trim things, the next thing we need to do is pin. So every so often I'm going to take a pin and I'm just going to place it, making sure that I catch both layers of fabric. So there's one. So I might go up here, and then to pin I'm just going to push until I feel my solid surface, lift up, and then push forward. And this keeps our fabric from moving around when we go to create the ties. So that's why it's a good idea to pin. Just make sure your pins don't get in the path of your rotary cutter or are too close to when we start cutting the ties, they're in the way. So maybe like for example on this edge here, I'm only going to go right here to place my pin. That gives me room to trim, and it's also going to give me room to cut my ties, and I'll show you that when we get to that point. So I'm going to keep pinning here, and then I'll show you the next step after we're done pinning. So after everything is pinned, you need to get your rotary cutter and your straight edge, or a pair of scissors will do it, but I can tell you I get nice and neat edges using the rotary cutting ruler and the rotary cutter itself. So I would recommend these. You can use a pair of scissors, but it's totally up to you. So I'm going to take my ruler. Now what I'm trying to do here in this step is I'm trying to get my pieces of fabric nice and even. I'm also looking to get rid of this selvage edge here for my tie blanket. So I'm going to be cutting this off, and I'm going to trim things nice and even here. Also, if you notice my blue fabric here, it's not quite cut evenly from the store. So I'm going to kind of square things up a little bit that way as well. So now how I do this, I'm going to start by trimming my edges up here. And again, I want a nice straight edge across my tie blanket. So I'm just going to pick a line here and get it close. And I'm going to line up that same line with one of these lines here in my fleece fabric. Then that way I've got a nice straight line all the way across. So once I have that lined up, I'm going to grab my rotary cutter, and I'm basically going to put my hand on my ruler and I'm going to cut across. So I'm going to cut as far as I can go with my ruler, close it here, and then I'm going to peel those back out of the way. So I'll have to keep working my way across there to trim that. I'm also going to have to, before I move my fabric, I'm going to start and trim as much of this selvage edge as possible. So again, I want as straight a line as possible. So I'm going to take, and this 2-inch line here looks like it's going to line up nicely with these boxes. So I'm just going to make sure I have that 2-inch line here lined up right next to this gray box and here on the edge of this gold for this box as well. That way I've got a nice straight looking line when I go to tie this blanket. Same thing, putting my hand here on the rotary cutter, I'm just going to pick a spot and start, and I'm going to cut all the way down this edge here, close my rotary cutter, and pull that selvage edge off. So I'm going to keep on trimming all the way around. I'll show you what this looks like here at the end, and then we'll move on to the next step. So each time I'm just kind of moving my ruler on down, again lining up my same distance here. So we again get a pretty straight line here across our tie blanket. I have also pulled my fabric so I can keep working my way down the edge. I've got this on a table now at this point. So there, I'm going to take that selvage edge and put it off to the side. So now again, I need to trim my bottom here to get these two edges even. So I'm going to take and again find a nice straight edge to start with. It's looking like here about 3 inches in is going to get us a nice straight edge all the way across there. So again, I'm lining things up, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to start cutting as well. So I'm going to keep on trimming here all the way around. So after we have evened up all of our edges, now we need to cut out some squares at the corners of our tie blanket, so that way you don't have a weird corner. And I'll show you what this looks like here as we get closer. So all of my fringe here is going to be 5 inches deep by 2 inches wide as we cut across. So what that means is here at the corner, I need to cut out a square that is 5 inches by 5 inches. So I like to use these little square rulers to kind of get my guide. You could also use a tape measure and mark. I just find this is a lot easier, and again gives me a cleaner cut if I use one of these little square rulers. I could also use this and just go 5 by 5, whatever works for you. So here I'm going to take my rotary cutter, or you could use a pair of scissors and just cut right next to it, whichever works for you. Again, I prefer my rotary cutter. I'm going to make sure 5 and 5. I'm going to cut right to the corner, and then here at the corner I'm going to cut that out as well, and then pull that square out. So that's what that should look like now. I'm going to repeat for the other 3 corners, and then we'll start cutting our fringe. Okay, so after we've cut out all 4 corners, we're now ready to cut the ties for our tie blanket. I like to cut my ties 5 inches by 2 inches wide. Now the reason I like to do this is it gives a nice substantial tie to tie with. If you cut these too narrow, sometimes fleece can come apart as you wash it and use it. So I like to cut it 2 inches to make sure my blanket's gonna withstand the rigors of life. So again, it's gonna be 5 inches by 2 inches this way. Now you can either use your rotary cutter to cut your strips, or you can use a pair of scissors, whichever works best for you. I prefer to use the rotary cutter. Okay, so I'm a little bit backwards here for you, but I will show you how I cut this. So again, I have my ruler. I have it lined up with 2 inches here, and then 5 inches this way. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches deep by 1, 2 inches wide. I'm gonna just take my rotary cutter. I'm gonna hold my ruler in place, and then I'm just gonna simply cut my strip. Okay, so there's one. Now I'm gonna continue this all the way down this side. When I get to the next corner, I'll show you what I do there. All right, so we've cut this entire side except for the last 2 strips here. Now before I cut these last 2, I like to measure here because this section can get a little bit too narrow or a little bit too wide for 2-inch strips. So you're gonna have to cut accordingly. And why this happens is because when you trim off the edges to get everything nice and square, sometimes it's not quite an even amount in inches. So this section right here is actually 4 1/4 inches, which would make each of our strips about 2 1/8 here at the end. You aren't even going to notice the difference in size. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take my little square here and I'm going to just line up 2 1/8. So on this ruler, you can see it's this little tiny line right here. So I'm going to take and I'm going to go 2 1/8 and line it up with that line I just cut. And then that's going to give me 2 pretty even strips here for the end. So I'm going to cut this last seam here, and that completes this side. So you can see I've got all my ties cut here down this side. Now again, I'm going to continue going this way and go all the way around, cutting 2 inch by 5 inch strips. So again, I'm going to come right here. I'm going to line up my 2 inch line. Oh, let me flip my ruler here so I have the right measurements. My 2 inch line with my 5 inch, so 5 inches by 2 inches. And I'm just going to start cutting these strips down this way, and I'm going to continue on. All right, so once we have cut all of our 2 inch by 5 inch strips, we're now ready to tie our tie blanket. So when I do this, I always start at one of my corners, and I'm going to tie one side first and then the other, and that gives us a nice even way to start. Another thing I do when I'm going to tie is I keep my pins in as well, so that way the fabric doesn't move around a ton on me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of my top ties and one of my bottom ties here for this very first piece, and I'm simply going to tie a knot. Now I need to be gentle when I tie this knot. I don't want to over tighten it, otherwise I get a lot of bulginess. So I tie one knot and then I tie another. Then I go to the next piece and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tie one knot, and things will kind of want to come in a little bit. So I'm going to tie one knot and then I'm going to tie the other. And I'm going to simply continue tying knots all the way around my blanket. Now I also need to, again, with every tie I tie, make sure to not tighten it too much. So I'm going to keep on tying my blanket here. So here's a more close-up of tying that knot. So literally I'm taking my top and my bottom, tie and tie. Okay, so once we've finished tying all of our ties all the way around, the last thing we need to do before we gift this or use it is make sure we pull all of our pins out and put them onto our pin cushion. So that way we don't accidentally poke somebody or ourselves with our pins. So go ahead and keep on doing that and you're ready to enjoy your blanket. I'll include a picture of the finished product of this at the very end of this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this and I hope you guys have a blessed day.